From Interfaith Alliance, this is State of Belief Radio. I'm your host, Reverend Welton Gaddy. U.S. Senator Ted Cruz blustered at Senator Chuck Hagel during the latter's confirmation hearings for Secretary of Defense. There were equal parts wet behind the ears upstart and timeless conspiracy theorist in Cruz's tone. The senator from Texas has quickly become a darling of the talking head circuit, where the paradox of legitimizing extremism in the pursuit of ratings dates back at least to the senator from Wisconsin, known for having hair in his hand and so forth and so forth. What role does religion play in supporting that kind of demagoguery? You know, I can't think of a better combination than Ted Cruz and Sarah Posner. And that's because I like Sarah. This week, Sarah Posner did an excellent job of connecting some of the dots in an article posted at Religion Dispatches. And I am so happy to have Sarah with us now on State of Belief Radio. Hello, Sarah.
Hi, Welton. That has got to be the first time anyone has spoken of me and the senator from Texas in the same breath like that.
I think it's good for the nation for you all to be in touch. Look, in looking at Ted Cruz and some of his statements, both before and since joining the U.S. Senate, you make some connections that I think are valuable in understanding both the man and also some characteristics of our national psyche. I was particularly struck by a quote that you included where Cruz refers to absolute truths. What does that mean?
Well, I think that was Cruz's way of saying to an evangelical magazine, World Magazine, that he understands its readers' Christian worldview. Mm-hmm. And that phrase has a very particular meaning for conservative evangelicals who've been steeped in this Christian worldview ideology. Mm-hmm. And that is that Christianity, their version of it, of course, offers absolute truths about the way the world works, and it is in a cosmic and ongoing conflict with other anti-Christian worldviews, which include Islam, postmodernism, communism, which they seem to think still exists in any meaningful form. And so without coming right out and saying those words, that was like a dog whistle to a certain audience who understands what he's talking about there.
I see. Ted Cruz, Sarah, strikes me to be taken more seriously, at least for now, than the likes of Michelle Bachmann or Louis Gohmert, who have both infamously trafficked in anti-American conspiracy theories. Is Cruz different?
Well, Cruz is different because he is a senator. He got elected by an entire state as opposed to one district. So senators necessarily have more power and more gravitas than members of Congress like Louis Gohmert or Michelle Bachmann do. And I think because he is Latino, he's viewed by the Republican Party as a future star that they can cultivate so they're not just seen as the party of white nativists. Mm-hmm. And so I do think he occupies quite a different position in the conservative movement and in the Republican Party than those other people. Although I have to say, I don't see a lot of difference, ideologically speaking, between him and Congresswoman Bachmann, who I've spent a lot of time watching.
And critiquing.
Yes.
Well, look, how does religious orientation really bolster the credibility of someone like Ted Cruz?
Well, I think to a conservative audience it does, and in a way it's just become a kind of knee-jerk thing to talk about. I mean, you can't be a Republican candidate, a viable Republican candidate, without talking about what a good Christian you are. So I think that it's kind of pro forma in that world. Uh-huh. I think it could work against him in this instance just because he took such a outlandish position with regard to Senator Hagel. Well, I guess I should say Secretary of Defense Hagel now. And to the extent that that's equated with a certain religious worldview, I think that could be problematic for Senator Cruz.
How much of this has to do with successfully portraying socialism as anti-God, evoking the Red Scare, the Red Scare of the past?
Well, the quote that led to the piece that I wrote at Religion Dispatches was something he said in a number of different contexts, which was that Harvard Law School was just crawling with communists. It was, there were more communists on the faculty than Republicans, and if you want to understand Barack Obama's worldview, just take a look at the faculty at Harvard Law School, which is, not only ridiculous because it's not true that Harvard Law School has any communists, as far as I know, on the faculty, but also that, of course, President Obama is also not a communist. And so, he didn't evoke that. He used the same sort of technique, if you will, with Hagel in the confirmation hearings to suggest that Hegel was an enemy of the state because of his alleged connection to imaginary groups like Friends of Hamas, or his inadequate loyalty to Israel. So it's the same technique with a different subject matter.
Yeah. Sarah, some commentators have noted that among a significant proportion of the conservative electorate, McCarthyite is not a dirty word. But how much of the attention Ted Cruz is getting has to do with a welcoming audience for his message, and how much of that is kind of a see what sticks message confusion on the right?
Well, I think that there is a little bit of that, let's see what sticks. So we'll try. We don't like Chuck Hagel. We'll try to figure out a bunch of things, a bunch of spaghetti to throw at the wall and see what sticks, right? But I do think that it's emblematic of the way Cruz operates. So I don't like this person. This person somehow represents some view of America that I don't like, or that I think my constituents don't like. And so I'll just hurl these completely baseless accusations that touch on fears that my base has about the other. So in the case of Hegel, the other was Muslims, Arab states, Palestinians, and us were, the good Christian nation and Israel. So he sets up this, either you're with us or against us sort of thing. And the same thing with his claims about Harvard Law School. There's Barack Obama and there's me. And I was the besieged lone conservative at Harvard Law School, and just look at all the communists there to explain the other, President Obama. Now, he knows that there's an audience for this, because among his admirers, for example, are, David Noble, who I read about in the piece about Cruz, who I actually first saw praising Cruz in 2010, when shortly after this interview at World Magazine appeared, where he made the accusation about Harvard Law School being filled with communists. And Noble, who first in the early 1960s worked with Christian anti-communists, at the height of the Cold War and the height of Red Scare, and founded this educational ministry called Summit Ministries, where young evangelical Christians go and learn about these different worldviews that are in clash with the Christian worldview, as I described before. And Noble was so excited that that Cruz had taken up this claim that these storied institutions are filled with communists, that he included it in his 2010 reissue of the 1960 book, You Can Trust the Communists to Be Communists, and he added the additional phrase, socialists and progressives too. So Noble, an admirer of Cruz, a promoter of Cruz, sort of elides this what is really a communist in the book and to say, well, communism is still alive in America. It's the Congressional Progressive Caucus. They're just communists in the 2012 costume. And so he makes the claim that not only is Harvard Law School crawling with communists, but there's a fifth column of communists in the United States Congress. So, and this is all in defense of the Christian worldview. So Ted Cruz is no dummy. He knows there's an audience for that, I think, but perhaps he's a little misled about how large the audience might be.
Yeah, I hope so. Well, look, let's change topics for a moment. You've also talked on your Blogging Heads TV program recently about pro football player and public Christian Tim Tebow and his decision to withdraw from speaking at a fundamentalist church, the historic First Baptist Church in Dallas. Why did you do that?
Why did I even talk about it?
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness. I resist the temptation to talk about Tim Tebow always. But Paul Rauschenbusch at the Huffington Post had written a story making the argument that Tebow has sidelined the religious right because he's the new golden boy of the religious right. And by him rejecting Pastor Jeffress' invitation to speak at his church, he's essentially saying, oh, that old guard and all their nasty rhetoric is so yesterday. I'm the evangelical of the future. And, I wanted to have a little, let's say, argument with Paul about it, because I think that Tebow has a lot of things to think about beyond whether he's the poster boy for a new kind of religious right or a new kind of evangelicalism, or whether he's insulting or sidelining or whatever the old guard. I think Tim Tebow has his own personal football and post-football reputation to think about. And I don't think it's said much more than Tim Tebow has to look out for Tim Tebow's reputation.
Well, is it an ongoing story, or is this just about Tebow staying away from controversy to ensure maximum commercial endorsements?
Well, I think that's part of the story, but there's the other part of the story is that people are always trying to convince us that the religious right is dead, and the younger generation of evangelicals don't want to hear that nasty rhetoric, and they're tired of it, and they want to talk about something else like human trafficking or something like that. And I don't think that moves like Tebow's prove that because of what you just said, because he's concerned about his reputation. And I think we still need to see more proof of that. If it's true, then that would be great news. But I'm skeptical that it's as true as or widespread as people say. I mean, I do think that they care less about the same-sex marriage issue and so on, but we still see so much evidence that nasty rhetoric wins you a Senate seat in Texas that, I hesitate to draw those kinds of conclusions so quickly.
Tebow's public displays of faith, though, we know have made this a story. Is there anything to be learned here?
Well, I think that, one person cannot represent an entire movement, particularly one person whose mission in life, yes, it is on the one hand to spread his faith. I mean, I think that he's made that perfectly clear. But it's also perfectly clear that he's a professional football player. And he, in all likelihood, has an agent who's very concerned about his public image and his money-making prospects and endorsements and what he's going to do after he retires from football, and also whether he's actually any good at football anyway. And so I think that, you can't, just like you couldn't extrapolate what is American Jewry like from one Jewish football player or one Jewish baseball player or one Jewish basketball player. It's more complex than that, and I think people tend to like to see a bigger story in somebody like Tebow because he's good-looking and he doesn't talk like Jerry Falwell, and oh my goodness, does this say something new about evangelicalism? And it says, no, it says something about Tim Tebow, and people's reaction to him says something about evangelicalism, but the reaction to from the religious right about his withdrawal from First Baptist was dismay.
Yeah.
So,
well, I mean, I kind of if last year was any suggestion of what the future holds, I thought maybe he withdrew to practice more because it wouldn't hurt him.
Well, there's that too. Mm-hmm.
Sarah Posner, senior editor at Religion Dispatches magazine. It's well worth a visit to religiondispatches.org on a regular basis to keep up with Sarah's writings on the issues of the day. And I'm grateful she's taken the time to be with us again on this week's show. Every time we get into one of these discussions, Sarah, I remember why it's important for me to talk with you regularly.
Oh, well, thank you, Welton. It's always my pleasure to talk with you.